Good morning, everyone. Pastor Sergio, one of the pastors here at Woodside Village Church. If this is your first time or 30th time, welcome and happy pre-Thanksgiving, since I won't see you after this service before you get to celebrate the wonderful holiday of Thanksgiving and trying to figure out conduits to place bacon and butter or whatever fattening thing, sugar, onto. That's what I find what we do most of the time with what makes, things like turkey that's really bland, tastes really good. It's just figure out more ways to put butter and bacon on it. Maybe some of you, all the above with sugar, which is what this season is all about. Part of it for us is just figuring out ways to just be together with family and friends and just to enjoy things that are decadent, that we wouldn't normally do except for these wonderful seasons where we forget that we had a diet and we just go all in and just enjoying the warmth as our body also gains more weight along the process. But this time of season for many of us, I want to begin by asking us a question, which is, what does this time of the year invoke for you? As you think about now we're heading into Thanksgiving, as I mentioned earlier, a time that most of us gather with family and friends. I'm sure that a lot of us have traditions and things that we do and we like to do. Like for me on Thanksgiving, it's a really slow day for me. I like to sit around and watch football and watch my fantasy football team mostly not do well. But it's fine. It's a part of the love and hate relationship that I have with fantasy football. I'll walk around the neighborhood to make myself, my body prepare for the great meal to come and spend the latter half of the day just slowing down and enjoying and allowing myself to just relax and decompress a bit. We all have traditions and things that we like to do, and in particular, when we think about the church and we think about Thanksgiving and what we call the Advent, which begins next week, which is thinking about the anticipation of Christ. We as a church, not just here at Woodside Village, but traditionally the capital C church, we have traditions and things that we do. We have feasts and time that we gather with friends and family and gifts that we give. And I think that many times those things are amazing. It's so good to slow down and be present with people, especially the crazy uncles that we never sit next to, but somehow this season gives us permission to do so. But this season, more than just those things and traditions, these traditions actually mean something. They find a place in a home somewhere. And I think over the course of years and decades and centuries of being in this West, of being in America for centuries, we take these traditions and we forget actually that these traditions, that the things that we do together with other people, think about gifts and feasts, we forget that actually there's a rich history and a reason why, as Christians, there are different things that are actually meant to invoke. These traditions exist to bring attention and awareness of something that Christ wants us to reflect and think about, that many times we forget because we forget the history. We forget why these things exist for the ways that they exist. And so for today, I want to do that today by helping to remind us a bit of the history and why this season exists the way it does. Why is it in this season that we're so full of more generosity and joy and a sense of being with others and presence and feasts? Why is it like this? And today I want to do that by reflecting on the genealogy of Jesus. The genealogy of Jesus, meaning that if you could trace his lineage all the way back, you would find that through these people and stories, that it invokes why we do and why we celebrate and prepare for this time in the ways that we do. And so, for that, we're going to give us a little roadmap for our time today with 3 points. One is that the genealogy of Jesus is a journal of God's work. It defines for us who the gift of Christmas is for. And finally, it ushers in the beginning of a new reality. First, a journal for God's work. If you could, there's Bibles in front of you. I don't want you to pull out your electric ones because if you do, you'll get notifications and that'll be the end of it. But if you can, turn to Matthew chapter 1, which is a long genealogy of Jesus. And the reason why I do this is, one, because I spared our beloved Amy from reading all of those names that are very hard to pronounce. Yes. God bless you, Amy, and thank you for always reading. And I see you. I didn't make you read all those names. But also, these names actually mean something. Genealogies were really common in Jesus' day and prior because they meant and tell you something about the person that you're anticipating that's arriving. And Matthew chooses very specifically a way to write this genealogy to help you to understand something about the person and about the arrival of Jesus. And one of the things that should maybe jump off to you when you begin to read in verse 2 is the genealogy begins actually with Abraham. And what's fascinating, the fact that it begins with Abraham, is that Abraham isn't the first person to have ever existed. But Matthew specifically chooses Abraham because there is a chunk of history and time that the Bible actually forces you to think about. Sometimes the way the Bible is constructed and made, it doesn't just give you all the specifics written down, but sometimes it specifically leaves out something for you to actually ask and provoke the question. Which is why Jesus' genealogy only go up to Abraham. Why doesn't it go back to Adam and Eve, which, as followers of Jesus, we would say are the first humans to have existed on the face of this earth? Why doesn't it go back that far? And what the author's forcing you to do is to think about, actually, the history of what happens between Genesis 3 to Genesis 11, when he begins to talk about the genealogy starting with Abraham. And if you're a good Bible student, you know that in Genesis chapter 3 marks actually a really important point in biblical history, or in human history, which is that Adam and Eve, they decide to separate ways with God and choose not to be in relationship with God, which is what we call traditionally the first rebellion. When humanity decides that they no longer want to be in a relationship with God, but want to define good and evil based on how they see and think about reality. And when you keep reading the Bible, you get to this, what we call the second rebellion, which is in Genesis 6, which is a spiritual rebellion. And there God makes a decision to deal with evil, physical and spiritual, by causing a flood to wipe everything off the face of the earth while only leaving one family on it. And then you get the third rebellion in Genesis chapter 11 with the famous story of the Tower of Babel, proving that God could wipe everything off the face of the earth, and yet there's something within the propensity of humanity to do evil, to think that they're God, and they believe that they can dictate terms on their own. And what Genesis 3 to 11 actually help you to see, give you a little window into the fact that we as humans have a propensity for what I called to do well-intentioned harm. We have all sorts of good intentions, but yet, because of our fallenness, our inability to understand good the way good is meant to be seen, we cause all sorts of well-intentioned harm. Or as C.S. Lewis would put it, all that we call human history, money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery, is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. And purposefully, Matthew begins the genealogy with Abraham because there's a change that God does within the story of Abraham. God remembers a promise that he began at the very beginning when Adam and Eve chose to walk away from him. God made a promise in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that one day someone would come, and as it says there, to bruise the head of the serpent, which actually in the Hebrew is better as strike the head, which is seen as a death blow to evil, is the imagery it's supposed to give you. That someone would come along and be the death blow to evil that has come into humanity in its reality, and all the implications that come with that. And the genealogy begins with Abraham because that is God coming into history, to human history, starting in Genesis chapter 12, by intervening, by selecting a family to bring about God's plan into action to save it from itself. And if you remember from last week when we talked about Abraham and the son Isaac, the whole story is about the longing of a son. That it's about a son coming to fulfill a promise, to continue a work and a legacy of God's work and doing. And that this son would come and change the course of reality for Abraham and all of humanity. And Matthew begins with Abraham because what he wants you for you to focus in on when you think about Jesus and his genealogy is that God has had a plan this entire time. That nothing is outside of the scope of God's plan. And what this genealogy is, it is a consistent work through all of time and history of God specifically moving to enact his plan, showing complete supremacy and dominance for what he wills to be done. So a part of this Advent season as we prepare, as we think about what it means to enter into this season is to understand that God is in control. That God sees you, that God knows you, and that he offers you good news, that there's hope despite the hopelessness that exists, that God is always in control. That the genealogy shows that God, nothing has ever been outside of his plan, that everything falls within his will and his way. Which hopefully for some of us that come in here feeling a little weary, it should feel like a child when we think about home. Like I thought about home when I was 6 years old, when I was thinking about when I was younger, what the picture of home was like. Home was a place that despite how sometimes it might be, that home was a place that you can go to. At 6 o'clock, you could always anticipate there'd be dinner on the table, a warm bed for you to sleep on. Home is a place that no matter what happens to you outside, how injured you get, or the wonderful tales you have, home is the safe place that allows you to understand that no matter what happens, that everything at the end will be fine. And what this genealogy is supposed to do is to be a sense of home for you. For those that are followers of Jesus, that no matter how weary you might feel as we come to the end of the year, whether plans of yours have succeeded or failed, that everything will be okay because God loves you and you fall within the course of his plan and his purpose always. As a part of the Advent, to invoke this idea that you are a part of God's plan and you fulfill a purpose and a meaning in all of that. Which, too, this genealogy actually echoes a second theme that I think is really important for us to understand and to invoke in this Advent season, which is, who is this gift actually for? Who is actually able to receive Jesus and to enact this purpose and ability into their lives? Genealogies, as I said earlier, were very important. Mainly nobility and kings would go to great lengths back in Jesus' day and before to create genealogies. Mainly for two reasons. And why would they go through so much trouble to do it? One is that it legitimized their power. If you could prove a lineage of how you came to power or how you came to get all of this wealth, it legitimized your source of wealth or power. So that's why, for example, when you created and crafted a genealogy, normally what you would include is the best record of all the things that have happened within your family line. Because you'd want no one to ever doubt your ability, the power to rule or to have access into that wealth. You would never want someone to challenge that. And so with great ability and a propensity usually to lie, you would create a nice crystal clean genealogy that would create a perfect legitimacy for what you want to do. But the second reason why a lot of people would have a genealogy like this is because it also allows them to gain purpose and ability to do what that person wants to do with that wealth and power. Like, for example, like when you look at the book of Exodus and you see Pharaoh subjugating God's people for hundreds of years, it records for you, actually, that there was a Pharaoh once upon a time that saw God's people as a threat. And that for hundreds of years they enslaved them because they feared this threat of God's people growing to such a large size, scale, and power. And so that meant the pharaohs after that could legitimize their power and dominance over them because past pharaohs saw it to be fit, and they're just continuing the legacy and the history and the wisdom to enact power in that way. But Jesus' genealogy is very different. Jesus' genealogy actually does not serve to do that. In fact, if you were to create a genealogy, you would never create one in the way that Jesus or that Matthew creates actually for himself. Just to pick a few of the greatest hits from this genealogy, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3, 5, and 6, there's these wonderful stories and characters within the story. Like, you have Judah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, if you are familiar with the Bible and who Tamar is, well, in that story in the Bible in Genesis, it's about how she manipulates Judah to sleep with her, to have a child because he was unable and unwilling to. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, you have Rahab as a part of Jesus' genealogy. Rahab, if you remember, also in Exodus, was a prostitute. And in fact, wasn't even one of God's people. Probably not someone that most kings would choose to probably put in their genealogies or talk about. In Matthew verse 5, you have there Ruth, who's a foreigner and not one of God's people, and yet becomes a part of the covenant of faith. And then you have in verse 6, David. And what's interesting, when Matthew writes this genealogy, he actually doesn't put down her proper name of Bathsheba. He purposely chooses to say Uriah's wife, which, if you remember that beautiful story, was how David sees this beautiful woman called Bathsheba, who was Uriah's wife, and sleeps with her and decides and finds out that she's pregnant. So what he decides to do is like, well, I'm going to figure out a way to kill him and then I'll marry her. Not the stuff of kings' genealogies that you would find, but yet Jesus' genealogy is full of stories just like this, of super flawed, imperfect people. People that are outsiders, immigrants, prostitutes, kings even. And what this genealogy is meant to paint for you is this idea of, again, who the gift of God is for. It's for everybody. That Jesus is the gift for everybody, of people of humble origins. It doesn't matter who you are, that God's plan works through all of us, especially for those that are low or high. It doesn't matter if you're a foreigner, an immigrant, a person of power or privilege. In fact, in a lot of these stories, what you'll find, they do very little doing even to justify their relationship and God using them. And yet it's purely faith and trusting in the gift of God. And in receiving it, God working that through them. Which, in this season, again, for those that find themselves hopeless, should be really encouraging for the fact that what this season is supposed to invoke for you isn't just a sense of God's supremacy and power, but a sense of good news for the fact that God loves you and wants to work his plan through you, and you can receive it by not doing, but by just receiving him as the gift that he is. But I find that many times in this season, we have a propensity to treat the good news of Jesus not as good news, but as good advice. As good advice. And what good advice is, it's good and kind words. Good advice is something that you hear that you like, that you can take and decide to do with what you want, a custom fit, based on how you project and you think about something. But good news, on the other hand, like news, is a telling of something that is important enough, that is newsworthy, that it's impactful, it's objective, it's reality, that will dictate something about your life. It's significant. That's why it's newsworthy. It's something that's worth declaring and discussing because of its impact into your reality. It's like, for example, if there's a massive earthquake that hit and divided that road right there in front of you. It would be newsworthy. And it would impact your life. You would have to rethink how to navigate down that road to go back home. I mean, luckily Woodside's full of horses. Maybe we could just leap over the chasm that's caused. But news does that. News is something that you receive, something that makes you have to think, reorient your life around. It changes reality for you. And that's what this season actually is supposed to invoke. It's supposed to invoke not just news of something horrible, but of good news. That God, through his miraculous plan, also includes you, and that you have, just as a recipient of good news, the remarkable joy of carrying it, which should also bring you the sense of joy, the kind of joy that makes you proclaim and share this good news. which is what this Advent season is supposed to be also, a place and a time of just immaculate joy for the fact that God has included you in his plan, and he cares deeply and values you deeply too, for nothing that you've done, but just for who you are, and for his great love for you. The best way I can explain this is like a parent receiving their child for the first time. When you receive a child for the first time, when you're in that day and you're in the operating room or wherever you find yourself and about ready to give birth, no parent goes, well, I'm about to have a baby. I'll just sit here and just wait around for it to eventually pop out and become a thing. No, most people are excited. They're tense. They're very expectant. It causes you to drop everything in that moment to go, to give birth to the child. And once the child is born, there's such an elation of joy that it causes you to post on every single social media platform possible. You'll pick up the phone and you'll text as many people as possible. There'll be a glow about you for days, and it doesn't matter how much sleep you lost for those 3 days, because you're now holding a new life that has now changed your reality completely for the better. And that's what this good news is supposed to be like in this season, is that it's like a child that you anticipate that is now with you, that you can't contain because of what he actually will do for you into this reality in life. Because many of us, we just assume and think that all we do with this baby Jesus is wait for heaven and eternity to come about. But actually, the child of Jesus, and this Advent reminds us, it actually has real implications for our lives that, like a child, completely change our realities to a new one, which is the third point. Advent and the new reality of life. I'm going to quote here from R.T. France on reflecting on these passages. He says, and he's a very well-known famous commentator, he says, the first 2 words in Matthew's gospel in this genealogy are literally the book of Genesis in the Greek. The effect on a Jewish reader is comparable to that of John's opening phrase, in the beginning. The theme of fulfillment of Scripture is signaled from the very start that these opening words suggest a new creation is now taking place. That particularly the concept of fulfillment is not clearly developed elsewhere in the gospel, which is concerned rather with how Jesus brings the history of God's people into its climax. But this passing echo of the beginning of the world's history adds a further illuminant dimension for those who wish to think it through, perhaps particularly in light of the creative act of God, which will result in Jesus' birth. Or actually what you see in the numerology at the beginning, where it goes from 14 generations from Abraham to David, and then from David to the exile, then from the exile to Jesus. 14 actually is emblematic of 7 times 2 on purpose. The author Matthew is using repetition 3 times with the number 14 because it took God to create the earth in 7 days, and to recreate, in a sense, is this idea and concept of recreation, of something new being birthed out of you again as you anticipate and you wait for the birth of the child. And using the example that I used earlier, that when someone has a new child, a new little baby, their life changes. There's no parent in here that after the second and third day elated with joy doesn't experience the hardships of the lack of sleep compounding itself. That when the child is born, it isn't just a change in having a child, but it's a change in your whole pattern and rhythm and being. Relationships change. The nature of how you relate to your spouse will change. The nature of just about everything changes because of what this new child and what this new life demands. And that's actually the picture that you're supposed to have with Jesus, that no matter how difficult life is, that you have the child, the thing that brings joy, the thing that brings freedom, this bit of good news that this Advent season is actually meant to invoke for you. And I want to end by thinking about where I began, which is, what does this season invoke for you? Or is it supposed to invoke for you as a follower of Jesus? For us, we have these traditions that I commonly separate into 2 different categories of feasting and of gift giving. These are rich traditions that we have taken to apply to our families, that when we buy a gift for somebody else on Black Friday, we give ourselves one for free, or to whatever cost you charge yourself. So it becomes a great time of giving for yourself and for others, particularly those that are close to you. But these are all traditions, actually, that echo way past our time and the Western ability to transform these traditions of family and friends and of gifts. The early church actually started the Advent season as a time of preparation. Actually, in the month before the Advent, followers of Jesus would spend this time with anticipation and joy preparing for what the season is actually meant to be, which is be about giving and about feasting. Actually, the Advent season, because of its joyous time and celebration of a reception of a child, the child of Jesus that changes and transforms all of life, feasts were actually enacted to welcome people to them. But mostly the tradition of the church was to invite people, strangers, people that you might not ever, during different times of your life, do because of the joy of sharing this good news of Jesus. We have taken it to mean just to radiate with our family and friends, which is great, and I'm glad that you delight in those things. But actually, these traditions exist because, one, we're supposed to feast with others, to be with strangers, to impart to them the good news, and to share the abundance of the kingdom, which is usually displayed on a table. Gifts, for example, this is a time usually where these are supposed to be emblematic of generosity. That because of this great gift, and just like a child that we tend to dump and lavish gifts on top of, it's emblematic of that as well, which is actually this season is also meant for others, to give to others, which is why even in our Americana of today, there is a sense of great generosity. That people, even outside of this church walls, or might not even know Christ, would experience his generosity and love for them through radical gift giving, which I shall make a shameless plug for our toy drive. Just to say that this is an opportunity for you to give to people and families that would not have. And wouldn't it be great if they came here to pick up the gifts on September 6th with their van and have hundreds of gifts here, that they would have to go back and dump it to come back to get more? That would be such a great thing for our church to do, for example. Something as small as that. I mean, I could talk about giving to the church, I could talk about giving to different organizations or people, but this is a time of season where you're supposed to use radical generosity more than any other, so that when people receive it, they can ask you why. Why am I receiving this gift that I didn't deserve? And you can glean onto Jesus' genealogy and understand, well, Jesus abundantly gives himself to those, especially those that don't deserve, because he loves you and he finds great purpose in you. And this time of season is a time of Advent for not just ourselves, but mostly it's for others, and to remind ourselves of the great and awesome news of who Jesus Christ is. And so, as I kind of end this service today, I was trying to think about a way to close it out, to help us to recreate, to rethink, what does it look like being a new parent, to reimagine and rethink your life? What would it mean for you to actually rethink your traditions? What would it mean for you to rethink what you do on Christmas and on Thanksgiving, or even the time in between, to think about others and to feast with others you probably wouldn't, and to give abundantly to others that you might not consider? But this season is particularly different because of the good news of God that you've received. And so what I want to do is I want to invite Irene to come back up here. I told you I'd give you a very clear signal. And I want to do actually a long response for us today. Because I know that for a lot of us, I could tell you to rethink and rechange and shape your lives, but I'd rather you do it actually in the feet of Jesus, and to think about that and to pray and consider that. To really spend a long period of time at what it means to rethink your reality to be other-centric. That it wouldn't be just about your family, but yourself, but using yourself and your family to actually be the gift to others. And so what I'd like to do is just to lead us through a traditional 4 rhythms of reflection and of prayer with God. And so if it's helpful to you, because I know for some people it is, if you want to posture your body by kneeling. There's kneelers in the front, you may do so. But I want to begin by inviting you to pray. And usually when we begin to pray, especially in long points of reflection, I want to invite you to just the invitation of proclamation, to spend a moment reflecting on who Jesus really is, that though he is an infant and we're reminded of his infant-like when he was born into this world, God has always existed from the beginning. And he made a choice at one point in human history to come and intervene with our lives and our brokenness for our sake. And in Luke chapter 1 it says, he will be great, and he will be called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever, and his kingdom will never end. So if you could just spend the next few moments just reflecting on the benevolent, wonderful King, Jesus. I wanted to invite you into the second motion of confession, or a time of allowing our wills to be aligned with God's will. And a part of what Jesus' genealogy reminds us is that Jesus is quite humble of a king. And a part of being a part of his kingdom is not just seeing his humility, but embracing our humility and our limits. As 1 Corinthians 4 reminds us, therefore judge nothing before the appointed time, and wait until the Lord comes, and he will bring to light what is hidden and expose the motives of the heart. And at that time each will receive their praise from God. And so just spend the next few moments just allowing God to search your hearts. And whatever he brings up, just to confess and to allow that part of you to be realigned to his love and his will. The next movement I want to invite you into is that of peace. Isaiah 9:6 says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Though it also makes this season, this time, good and wonderful, is that Jesus comes and brings peace. And the good news is that you get to be a peacemaker among the people and the relationships that you're in with today. And so if you could just spend some time just reflecting on how you can be more like Christ and a peacemaker in your homes and your family and your friends, your work environments, for the city, for this country and this world that so desperately longs to receive this good news of peace that Jesus is able to bring. If you just spend a few moments and pray over that. Finally, into our final movement, invitation to petition. That all of us, God and His providence and His love for you, places you specifically in places and environments where there are people that desperately need to hear of the good news of God. And what it would look like for you in this season to invite them to a feast, to receive generosity from your hand, knowing and sharing with them the love of Christ through those actions. As it says in Philippians 4:6, do not be anxious of anything, but in every situation by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. If you could spend the next few moments praying for whoever God pops into your mind and how you can intercede and bless and share with them and allow them to experience the good news of Jesus today.